We are recording. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Elena. Hello, everyone, all the way from London. It's quite late at night here. It's 11 o'clock, but I'm really excited to be with you over in Worcester County. I haven't visited Worcester County, but hopefully sometime in the future I will do. So my talk to you this evening is going to be primarily about the life of Anne Frank. And some people say to me, well, you know, I know Anne Frank, I really love her, I love her diary, but I think I know everything about her. And then when they've heard my talk, they then come up to me and say, well, I thought I knew about Anne Frank, but what I'm going to do with you this evening is really flesh her out as a real person so that you really understand who she was and where her family had come from and the people around her. Later on in my talk, I just hope you've got your suitcases packed and ready to go, because I'm going to take you on a very brief whistle-stop tour of the world and show the impact that she's had on really in some very surprising places in the last 30 years of people learning about her story. So without further ado, let's get going. Now, I can't tell you the story of Anne Frank without telling you about this man. And this is her father, Otto Frank. Now, on the left, we see Otto as a young man with his two adored daughters, Margot on the left and Anne on the right. And then as a much older man after the war. And I always say that this is the man, he is the reason that I'm speaking to you this evening, because he is our inspiration. And as the story moves on, you will really get to know why he's such an inspiration. Now, Otto Frank was born into a quite distinguished Frankfurt Jewish family in the year 1889, the same year as Adolf Hitler, actually. And the family had come out of the Frankfurt Jewish ghetto about 100 years before his birth. And by the time Otto was born, his father didn't just work in a bank in Frankfurt, he actually owned a bank, the Michael Frank Investment Bank. So you can see that the family had really sort of flourished and were very acculturalized and assimilated into Frankfurt society. As a young man, Otto Frank studied at Heidelberg University in Germany. And in 1908, he met and befriended a young American who was studying there called Nathan Strauss Jr. And Nathan invited his new friend Otto to come over to New York, where his father owned a business, and invited him to come do some work experience for his father. Now, Nathan Strauss's father owned a rather famous department store in New York called Macy's. And actually, I took the photograph on the right of Macy's, that's Nathan there in the inset, when I was last in New York. Because I travel to New York under normal circumstances quite frequently because I act as an advisor to the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect in the USA. And this is actually, I took this photo because this is actually the very doorway that Otto Frank would have gone in every day to do his work experiences at Macy's. Now, Otto absolutely loved New York. He loved America. He loved the brashness of it, the fact that it was so go ahead and everything was new, and probably would have stayed and maybe even become an American citizen, had not in 1909, his father, Michael Frank, died very suddenly, and Otto had to go back to Europe and help run the family bank. Now, he wasn't a natural banker. He was more a good small businessman, but nonetheless, he felt his responsibility and sailed back to Europe. In 1914, of course, his life changed when he was called up to fight in the First World War. And he fought so valiantly that by the end of the war, he had received the Iron Cross for bravery and been promoted to the rank of lieutenant, which of course didn't help him and his family some 20 years later. By the mid-1920s, the bank was not doing very well because, of course, the economic situation in Germany in the aftermath of the First World War was terrible. And so really the bank was on its last legs. But nonetheless, the Frank family still had a wonderful reputation among Frankfurt society. And Otto married in 1925 a woman called Edith Hollander. And she was the daughter of a wealthy industrialist from Aachen in Germany. And even though the Frank family had no money anymore, the reputation was still so high and they were so highly regarded that the family didn't care. This was still considered a good marriage. So Otto and Edith had a lovely society wedding, and then they went off to San Remo in Italy for their honeymoon. Now, the following year, on the 16th of February 1926, their first daughter, Margot Betty, was born. You can see her on the left, a beautiful little dark-haired, dark-eyed baby. And then 3 years later, on the 12th of June 1929, their next daughter, Anneliese Marie, arrived. And her name is soon shortened to Anne, and of course pronounced in the continental way of Anna. Now, I think this photograph actually of Anna on the right is rather poignant, because there she is lying asleep in her little bed, completely oblivious and innocent to what the world has in store for her. Now, this photograph was taken on a family outing into the centre of Frankfurt in March 1933. You can see Edith with Margot on the right, staring quite stoically into the camera, and little Anne sort of scowling at the camera. Probably there'd been a few too many photographs taken on that day. However, their lives had changed, because on 30th of January, just a few weeks before, Hitler had been appointed Chancellor of Germany. And then a few weeks later, also in March, the Nazi Party had taken control by being elected into power in Germany, and almost immediately started dismantling all forms of democracy. Anybody who criticized the regime was sent away to a labor camp, concentration camp. By the summer of that year, Otto Frank realized that there was no longer any future for his family in Germany, the country that his family had flourished in for generations. And so he started making plans to move his family. But where to go? Well, the neighboring country of the Netherlands had been neutral in World War I. And also it had a long history of toleration of other religions. For example, after the expulsion of the Jews of Spain and Portugal in the 15th and 16th centuries, many Jews had found their way to Amsterdam and helped build the city as the great trading nation that it became. On a more pragmatic note, he knew the city because he'd done quite a bit of business there, but his brother-in-law in Switzerland worked for a German company called Opekta, and Opekta manufactured a very popular product called pectin. Now, when I give this talk to a younger generation and I ask them if they know what pectin is, there's a lot of blank looks and sort of shaking of the head. But when I give it to an older demographic, people smile and nod, because pectin is a natural setting agent for making homemade jelly, which was very popular in Europe in the 1930s. I'm sure it was in America as well. People used to pick their fruit seasonally and bottle or preserve it for the winter. So he saw a real business opportunity in Amsterdam to open an office. Now, he went on ahead in the late summer of 1933 and found somewhere for the family to live, and opened an office initially on the Single in Amsterdam, a lovely street of canals. And then a little bit later on, he actually expanded the business, went into partnership with another German Jewish refugee, and they also imported spices for sausage making. And again, homemade sausage making was very popular in Europe in the 1930s. So it was a real business opportunity. Now, later that year, Edith, his wife, and Margot followed him to Amsterdam. And then the following year in February, Anne was brought to Amsterdam by her grandmother. They lived in an apartment in this development in South Amsterdam called the Mervedeplein. And at the time, it was a very modern development, and probably what attracted Otto Frank to it was the skyscraper at the back. The building at the back was probably the nearest thing to a New York skyscraper in Amsterdam at the time. But a lot of the German Jewish refugees settled in the same development and became a sort of support structure for each other. The development was built around a lovely grassy area where the children would get to know each other and play. The statue of Anne, of course, wasn't put up at the time because no one knew who she was, but it was put up a few years ago by the owner of a local bookstore around the corner. More about that later. Anne started the Montessori School just round the corner when she was 4 years old. A very popular form of education among the German Jewish refugees. They liked the balance of the formality, but informality and creativity of the Montessori education. Now there's Anne in her class. You can, if you look carefully, you can see her in the middle of the picture with a ring round her. So there's Anne at school. That's her elementary school. Now, it's still a school, and if you are in Amsterdam, you want to visit that area, which is a lot of places of interest in Anne Frank's story. It's still a school, and you can go and visit it. And in fact, the writing on the wall isn't some kid doing some graffiti, but in actual fact, it's a replica of Anne's writing in her diary. And they changed the name to the Anne Frank School in her memory. Anne was a very gregarious little girl and very outgoing. She loved her friends. And here you can see photographs of her playing in the street. You'll recognize the buildings of the Moveda Plain. Now, in the left-hand photo, Anne's on the right, and her little friend Susanna Lederman in the darker outfit is on the left. And in the right-hand photo, you can see Anne on the right, Susanna in the middle. I don't know who the girl is on the left. But when I talk to younger children, I ask them to look at the toys that the girls are holding, because they're very similar to the toys that kids would identify with now, for example, a hula hoop and the dolls. And in fact, if you look at the scooter, my little 3-year-old grandson recently took delivery of his first scooter. Now, people say to me, why are there so many photographs of Anne and Margot growing up? Well, it's quite true. Certainly, there are a lot of beautiful photographs that have become an incredible resource when you visit the Anne Frank house, or books on Anne Frank, or at the traveling exhibitions, which I'm going to tell you about a bit later on. That's because Otto Frank was a very, very keen photographer. He had a Leica in the 1920s, which he absolutely loved. Leica was a very, very good quality, very expensive camera. So his twin passions became photography and his two lovely girls. Also, I'm asked, how did these photographs survive after the family went into hiding? Well, in fact, Otto sent a whole chest of the photographs to his family who lived in Switzerland, and that's how they survived the war. The Franks had a good life in Amsterdam, and growing up, the girls enjoyed many different activities. You can see the picture on the left of the two girls at the popular seaside resort of Zandvoort, which was only about half an hour on the train outside Amsterdam. And there's Anne with her swimming togs ready to go for a dip in the sea. In the winter, they would skate on the canals, which would freeze over. Margot was very sporty, and she belonged to a rowing club and a tennis club. They even actually had holidays abroad, because in the summer they would go and visit their family in Switzerland, and they would spend lovely summer times up in the mountains. They'd all go away together into the mountains. So they were having a lovely time growing up in Amsterdam. Now, the 12th of June 1939, Anne celebrated her 10th birthday with her friends. And you can probably recognize Anne in the green dress, second from the left. Of course, this photograph wasn't developed in color, but I found it in color on the internet. Someone hand colored it, and I think it really sort of brings the photograph to life and makes these girls seem very real in their lovely little party dresses. So Anne second from the left. Now the girl on the far left is her good friend Jacqueline Van Marzen. Jacqueline is still alive and lives in Amsterdam. She's obviously a peer of Anne's, so she's in her early 90s now. I've met her several times. You might recognize next to Anne on her right is her little friend Susanna Lederman that she played with in the street. Sadly, Susanna's family were deported to Auschwitz in 1943, and little Susanna, sweet little Susanna, was gassed on arrival at Auschwitz. The slightly taller girl next along is another close friend, Hannah Pitt-Goslar, and she's still alive and she lives in Jerusalem. I've met her several times. She's a lovely lady. Now, the 5 girls on the right of the picture are Anne's non-Jewish friends because she had a wide circle of friends. And as I said, she was very popular, very outgoing. Interestingly, the tall girl right bang in the middle, by the time this photograph was taken, her father had already joined the Dutch Nazi Party. Now, just 11 months after this happy photograph was taken, the unthinkable happens. And on the 10th of May, 1940, the Germans bombard the port of Rotterdam on the North Sea coast of the Netherlands with bombs. And the bombing goes on for 5 solid days. The city of Rotterdam is completely flattened. Now, if you visit Rotterdam, you won't find a city of historical buildings like you do in Amsterdam. Very few historical buildings remain because of this bombing. It was rebuilt after the war, so it's a very modern city. After 5 days of this intensive bombing, the Dutch capitulate and the Germans invade the Netherlands. The royal family, led by Queen Wilhelmina, and the government flee to London. Now, for a while, things remain pretty calm, but really just after a few months, the measures against the Jews that the Dutch, that Mr. Frank fled his native Germany to avoid, start up again in earnest. And by 1941, due to these restrictive measures, Anne and Margot have to leave their school and attend a Jewish-only school. Mr. Frank has to hand over his business, which he's built up, to his non-Jewish employees. Now, fortunately, he's got very trustworthy managers, Victor Kugler and Johannes Kleiman, and they take over the business, and Mr. Frank supervises the business. He still keeps his hand in, but from a distance. He can't do it overtly. Now, writing in her diary a couple of years later, Anne describes what it was like as these measures against the Jews were brought in. She writes, after May 1940, the good times were few and far between. Our freedom was severely restricted by a series of anti-Jewish decrees. We were required to wear the yellow star, turn in our bicycles. We were forbidden to ride on trams or to go to theatres, cinemas, or other forms of entertainment. We couldn't go to swimming pools, tennis courts, or other athletic fields. You couldn't do this, you couldn't do that, but life went on. Now, in early 1942, in February, the German occupiers of the Netherlands issue a decree that young Jewish people aged between the age of 16 and 40 are going to be required to report to be deported to work camps in Germany. Very few of these young people that actually reported ever returned. They were simply worked to death. Now, Margot, the older daughter, turned 16 the same month of the decree. And so you can imagine Mr. and Mrs. Frank were getting very worried about their older daughter. Now, Mr. Frank's offices had moved to a building in central Amsterdam on the Prinsengracht. Gracht means canal in Dutch, the Prinsen Canal. And as you can see from this picture, you can see the blue outline of their building, and they were right bang in the center of Amsterdam. It was a typical 17th century Dutch merchant's building, very old, very narrow and steep. At the back of the building, above the warehouse and the offices of the staff was a set of rooms that many of the staff didn't even know existed because they weren't used. And if you look at the picture, you can see at the back of the building and the gable of the roof, that's where this set of rooms were. So in earnest, Mr. Frank, assisted by trustworthy members of his staff, Victor Kugler and Johannes Kleiman, started preparing a set of rooms, that set of rooms, in case the family would have to go into hiding because Margot would be called up. In fact, Mr. Frank had been trying for many years to get his family out of the Netherlands. He'd even been trying to get his family out of Germany after 1933. Even with the help of the influential Strauss family in America, they could not get visas to get to America. They were trapped in Europe. So this is why they started preparing a hiding place, because there was simply nowhere for them to go. So you can see here a front view of the old building of this 17th century merchant's house. Very steep, very narrow buildings with very steep steps. And the rooms had to be pre-prepared at night when all the office staff had actually gone home. So no one would know what they were doing. Not an easy task, because if you go to Amsterdam, you look at the buildings at the top of the roofs, you will, if you look up, you will always see that buildings have a hook, which they use as a hoist to bring building and large items up those steep stairs. Instead of going up the steep stairs, they bring them on the outside of the building and through the windows. But of course, they couldn't do this because they were doing this clandestinely at night, so no one would know what they were doing. One of the staff that was in on this, Victor Kugler, he had a suggestion that maybe they could build a bookcase and fill it with office paraphernalia like folders and files. And once the family had gone into the hiding place, the bookcase could be put against the door to the hiding place, so no one would suspect that there was a door there and anyone was in hiding. And this is in fact what happened. So once the Frank family were in the hiding place, that bookcase was closed against the door. And if you go to the M. Frank house, and I don't know if any of you have been to the M. Frank house, I hope you will at some stage, you will access the secret annex, the hiding place, through that very same bookcase. It's quite an experience, I can tell you. Now, the hiding place is being prepared. On the 12th of June 1942, it's Anne's 13th birthday. And a few days before her birthday, she's walking in the neighborhood with her father. And in the window of the local bookstore, it's actually the same bookstore, the man, remember, who put the statue in the Maveda Plain in honor of Anne. It's different ownership, but it's the same bookstore in the same place. Right bang in the front of the window, she spots this. And it's a little check-covered notebook. Probably what attracted her to it was this, a little brass lock. And what 13-year-old girl doesn't want a lock on a notebook? So she started dropping a few hints to her dad, like our kids do when it's coming up to Christmas or their birthdays, and that she would really rather like that notebook for her birthday. And Otto Frank goes back to the bookstore and he buys it for her, wraps it up, and he and Mrs. Frank give it to Anne as one of the gifts on her 13th birthday. Now she starts writing in the diary straight away, and just about a week later, she's actually given it a name. She's called it Kitty after a character in her favorite novel. And she has decided that Kitty is going to become her friend. Now, that's quite a confession from a girl who says she's got hundreds of friends and several boyfriends who actually can't keep their eyes off her. But Kitty, her diary, is going to become her true friend, her real confidant. So she starts writing in her diary. She writes about her school friends, and to be honest, she's not very kind about the girls and boys in her class. She's quite critical of and gossipy about them. But 1 week later, the unthinkable happens, and there is a ring at the doorbell on a Sunday morning at the apartment on the Maveda Plain, and it's a call-up notice, the dreaded call-up notice for Margot. They have to flee into hiding immediately. There's no time to lose. Margot was supposed to report at midnight to be deported to Germany. So the very next morning, the 6th of July, 1942, the Frank family walk across Amsterdam in the rain, carrying a very small bag and layers of clothes taken with them to go into hiding. When they get to the hiding place, Anne is very excited. She thinks it's very exciting to go into hiding, into a secret place. And she actually writes that there could be no more comfortable place in the whole of Amsterdam. Believe me, after a few months in hiding, she didn't feel so kindly about it. Now, initially, Anne shares a room with her sister, Margot. Two girls share a room together. But other people come to join them. After a week, they're joined by Mr. Frank's business associate, Herman van Pels, the man who brought the idea of the sausage spices to him. And he and his wife, August, and their son, Peter. Anne is very excited about this at first, although Peter, he's 16, he's more Margot's age, so they form a little unit, Peter and Margot, and Anne finds them tedious and boring anyway. And then in December of that year, they're joined by another German Jew called Fritz Pfeffer, and he's a local dentist. And he has to go into hiding and disappear for fear of his life. And so because there's limited space, Anne is forced to share her bedroom instead of with Margot, with Mr. Pfeffer. And really, she does not think kindly of this at all. In her eyes, Fritz Pfeffer is a tedious, disciplinarian, middle-aged man, a buffoon, stupid. She can't bear. Oh, by the way, worst of all, he snores, and she can't stand that. And they fight over the little writing desk in the room because Mr. Pfeffer wants to write letters to his fiancée, non-Jewish fiancée, who's on the outside. And Anne, of course, wants to write into her beloved red check notebook. So things are not going well between Mr. Pfeffer and Anne. Now, when they went into hiding, unbeknown to Anne, Otto Frank had brought her movie star photos to stick on her bedroom wall to give her a flavour of something she loved and remind her of being at home. And so this was a lovely surprise for her, and she stuck the images on the wall. Now, if you visit the Anne Frank house, you will see those very same pictures on the wall in her bedroom, covered in glass. And as well as movie stars, she loved royal families, particularly the British royal family and the Dutch royal family. Now, several years ago, I was taking the Queen's youngest son, Prince Edward, the Earl of Wessex, around the Anne Frank exhibition. And there was a photograph in the exhibition of Anne's bedroom wall. And so I said to him, is there anyone here on Anne's bedroom wall that you recognize, sir? And he sort of looked and looked, and he said, oh my goodness, there's my mother. And so it was really quite amusing. But if you look at the bottom left of the picture, there's two little pictures together, one above the other, of two little girls, and that's Princess Elizabeth and her sister, Princess Margaret. And so that was rather fun, showing the Queen's son a picture of his mother on Anne's bedroom wall. Now, of course, Anne had taken her diary with her into hiding, and she started writing straight away in her diary about all aspects of being in hiding, how it felt to be isolated from her friends, not being able to go to school, what went on in the secret annex every single day, how annoying all the adults in hiding were for her, in her eyes. What was happening on the outside of the hiding place, and what would happen to them if they were ever discovered. She wrote about her dreams of growing up, imagining her future life when the war was over. and also her ambition to be a writer. In April 1944, she wrote, "When I write, I can shake off all my cares. My sorrow disappears. My spirits are revived." Now, over the course of the 2 years that Anne was in hiding, she was transitioning from a child into an adolescent and going through all that comes with that. The bodily changes, the emotional changes, and of course, her growing feelings of sexuality. By early 1944, all those feelings were being focused on Peter van Pels, the only boy teenager she could ever see. And so she writes very vividly, very beautifully, very candidly about falling in love with Peter, her teenage romance. And the two of them would actually go upstairs above the secret hiding place to the dusty old, dirty old attic. And they would spend time together, sharing their most intimate thoughts, and actually even sharing a teenage romantic kiss, which Anne writes about in her diary. She was finding comfort and excitement in Peter's company. But it was short-lived. After a few weeks of this intensity, her feelings for Peter start waning. She's discovered a new passion. Well, in April 1944, the Dutch education minister in exile in London broadcasts on the BBC, and they'd actually had a clandestine wireless in the hiding place and listened to the BBC every day for news of what was happening in the war. And the education minister announces that he would like to see people who are trapped in occupied Netherlands keep journals and diaries about their experiences under occupation, and they would be published after the war. So Anne is writing frantically from then on because she wants to see her diary published after the war. So she's writing, continuing to write in her diary, and simultaneously she's editing everything she's written in the 2 years previously with a view to having it published. This is her new passion. Another thing that gave her great comfort in hiding, as well as her writing, was nature. And she readily admits that in her previous life before the hiding, she had taken nature for granted, which I'm sure a lot of young people who have been in lockdown over the past year have probably felt the same. She writes a lot about nature, and her only view of nature was from the little window at the top of that dusty, dirty old attic where she and Peter used to go, because all the windows in the actual secret annex where they were hiding had been blacked out in case anyone could see in. She writes, for example, "It's not my imagination. Looking at the sky, the clouds, the moon and the stars really does make me feel calm and hopeful." Now, I can't tell you the story about 2 years of hiding of 8 people without telling you about these astonishingly brave people. And these were the helpers, and they were all Otto Frank's staff, just a few of the staff members, but those were the ones he could really trust. Now, if you look at this picture, which was taken after the war, because when Mr. Frank returned to Amsterdam after the war, he went back into the business together with his staff. And on the left at the bottom is probably the most well-known of the helpers, Miep Gies, and I'll explain why she was well-known a little bit further on. On the right is the secretary, Bet Voskil. She was very young. She was almost sort of Margot's age, so they had a lot in common. At the back is Johannes Kleiman and then Victor Kugler on the right. And those were the two managers that were in on the secret of the hiding place right from the very beginning. And it was Victor Kugler who actually had the idea of the bookcase to conceal the door. Now, remember that the Netherlands was occupied, and it was very, very difficult to get enough food to feed your own families because of rationing, let alone feeding 8 extra people, adults in hiding. So sometimes, for example, Miep would have to cycle miles every day out into the country to go and visit farms to get enough food to feed the people. And of course, the food was very, very basic and very minimal Mainly they survived on cabbage and potatoes for 2 years, which you can imagine Anne really loved. Now, I had the great privilege of spending a lot of time with Miep in the 1990s and early 2000s. She died in 2010 at the phenomenal age of 100. And there's a photograph of us in the 1990s taken in Anne's bedroom. And just outside the window, you can see the chestnut tree that Anne writes about so vividly in her diary. Miep and I also attended the 1996 Academy Awards in Hollywood together because a documentary that I'd commissioned called Anne Frank Remembered, if you ever get a chance to see it, it's absolutely wonderful, won the Best Documentary Feature Oscar that year. So you can imagine what it was like walking down the red carpet with Miep Hees, the helper of the Frank family. And when it won, the director of the documentary took Miep up on stage, and in front of the audience of the theatre and 1 billion people around the world watching the ceremony, he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, in a city of celluloid heroes, please meet a real one." And you can imagine the audience just erupted in the auditorium when they realized that the woman on the stage was none other than the helper of Anne Frank. Oh, there you are. There's some lovely memories. That's myself and Miep, and the director John Blair in the background on the right, and a Hollywood executive on the left, and just going down in the limousine and seeing the Hollywood sign. It was pretty amazing. On the 6th of June 1944, British, American, Canadian troops landed in France to liberate Europe from the Nazis. On that day, Anne writes so excitedly about the thought of liberation, and she writes that she feels friends are on their way. And maybe, just maybe, by the fall, she can go back to school, which is quite an interesting thing for a girl who was constantly in trouble with her teacher at school for chatting in class. But she was desperate. She really dreamed of the day that she could get back to school. So you can imagine after June the 6th, through that summer, hopes were really high of the 8 people in hiding that they would soon be liberated. But it was not to be. On the 4th of August, 1944, a beautiful, warm, sunny, bright day in Amsterdam. At 10 o'clock in the morning, someone, and we'll never know who, makes a call to the Gestapo in Amsterdam to report that there are Jews hiding at 263 Prinsengracht. Half an hour later, the door of the office, Mr. Frank's office, the offices of Mr. Frank's business burst open. And there is an Austrian Gestapo officer called Karl Josef Silberbauer, accompanied by 2 Dutch policemen wielding pistols. They point the pistols at Johannes Kleiman and Victor Kugler and point to the bookcase, beckoning them to open it, and upstairs they go. The 8 terrified people in hiding are taken downstairs and arrested and taken away. Initially, they're taken to the Gestapo headquarters in the south of Amsterdam, where they're interrogated for 2 days. Then they're put on a train to Westerbork camp, transit camp in the north of the Netherlands. At the beginning of September, the 3rd of September, their names are called, all 8 of them in hiding together. Their names are called and they will have to board the transport that will take them to Auschwitz in Poland. Now, sadly, had they been arrested perhaps a month later, they would not have been sent to Auschwitz, because the train they were on was the very last transport out of the Netherlands to Auschwitz. On the 6th of September, they arrive at Auschwitz. And on the platform at Auschwitz, the men and the women are separated, and they never see each other again. At the beginning of November, Anne and Margot are separated from their desperate mother, Edith, and they are sent on to Bergen-Belsen in the north of Germany. Now, Bergen-Belsen by that time was a very difficult place to survive. It was almost abandoned by the Nazis. There was very, very little food. It was a very cold winter. The water was contaminated, and there were waves of the deadly disease of typhus going through the camp. And if you have no nutrition, you have no food, your body is not able to withstand the disease of typhus. Sometime in February or March 1945, we don't know exactly when, Margot, followed about a day later by Anne, give up their fight to live. Their little bodies, their emaciated, starved bodies, are thrown into a mass pit. The gravestone that you see, of course, wasn't put there at the time. It was erected fairly recently by their cousin, their late cousin, who lived in Switzerland. And if you visit Bergen-Belsen, you can see the grave to Anne and Margot. By the time Anne and Margot lay dying and taking their last breaths in Bergen-Belsen, Otto Frank had already been liberated from Auschwitz on the 27th of January and was on his way back to Amsterdam. He arrived in Amsterdam 5 months later after the liberation, because of course Western Europe was still heavily at war by the time he was liberated. He arrived back in Amsterdam in June 1945 and desperately searched for any news of his daughters. Now, bear in mind, Otto had nowhere to live because his apartment on the Merwede had been requisitioned and actually given to a Nazi sympathizing Dutch family. So he goes to live with Miep and her husband Jan, and starts searching for his daughters. Now, he knew Edith, his wife, had died in Auschwitz on the 6th of January, 3 weeks before its liberation. He puts an advert in the local newspaper if anyone has news of them. However, one day he's in the office and a telegram arrives from the Red Cross. It is the news that he's dreaded, confirming that the girls are both dead. He goes out of his office, ashen-faced, with the telegram, and he goes to Miep, who's sitting at her desk, and he says, "Miep, the girls are no more." And with that, Miep goes to her desk drawer and pulls out the little red check notebook. "Here you are, Mr. Frank. Here is the testament of your daughter." Unbeknown to Otto, Miep had rescued Anne's diary. She'd very bravely gone upstairs and broken the lock to the hiding place after the family had been taken away. In the hope that Anne would soon be coming back, the liberators were on their way and maybe the war would soon be over. There wasn't much to salvage because the officers had arranged for everything to be taken of any value. But there on the floor was the diary and the other exercise books and papers written by Anne. So she gathered them up and put them in her desk drawer. Mr. Frank went away and read his daughter's diary and realized that he'd never really understood the hidden depths of his daughter. All he saw was a very precocious, cheeky little girl who had an answer for everything. But really, in the later days of her writing, she was becoming a very responsible, mature young lady who took real responsibility for changing the world and making it better, a better place for everybody. Now, he had a moral dilemma because on the one hand, he knew Anne's greatest ambition was to be a published writer. But on the other hand, she was not very kind about her mother, who she had a lot of tension with in hiding. They were very different personalities. And she always thought that her mother favored Margot, always took Margot's side. And also the other adults in hiding, Mr. and Mrs. Van Pels, Fritz Pfeffer, of course, and even her own sister Margot, she didn't speak very kindly of in the diary. And he wanted to preserve the memory of these people who'd all been so cruelly murdered. But he showed it to a few people whose advice he took seriously, and most of them said this diary should be published. And eventually a publisher came forward called Contact. It was a small Catholic publishers who agreed to publish Anne's diary in a run of 1,500 copies, just to test the water and see how the land lay. It was called Het Achterhuis. It was published on the 25th of June, 1947, 2 years after Otto had returned to Amsterdam. Het Achterhuis means the back house. And by December of that year, it had gone into a second edition. Such was the interest. By February the following year, there was a third edition. And then other countries started publishing the diary, including Germany and Japan, who were on the opposing side in the war. So Anne had written in one of her very first entries, writing in a diary is a really strange experience for someone like me, not only because I've never written anything before, but also because it seems to me that later on, neither I nor anyone else would be interested in the musings of a 13-year-old schoolgirl. Well, not interested? To date, Anne's diary has sold more than 30 million copies. It's been translated into more than 70 languages. I was actually walking through Bangkok airport several years ago, and I saw a copy in the airport bookstore in the Thai language. Every year there's new books and musical interpretations and dramas and documentaries about Anne's life. It's endless. And the traveling exhibition about her life has been seen by more than 9 million people around the world. It was John F. Kennedy that said in 1960, of the multitude who throughout history have spoken for human dignity in times of great suffering and loss, none is more compelling than that of Anne Frank. And you might recognize the rather pretty lady in the middle of this photograph. That's none other than Audrey Hepburn. And here she's pictured with Mr. Frank and his second wife, Fritzi, also a Holocaust survivor. And he married her in 1953. And together, Fritzi and Otto devoted the second half of their lives to promoting Anne's diary as a force for good in the war. And Audrey Hepburn has often spoken about what Anne's diary meant to her when she first read it, because she was actually, although she wasn't a Holocaust, she wasn't persecuted in the Holocaust, she wasn't Jewish, she actually spent her teenage years in Arnhem in the Netherlands, and her mother was in the Dutch resistance. And Audrey herself, as a teenager, she ran errands for the Dutch resistance. So much of her childhood and her teenage years were spent exactly the same as Anne, and it absolutely broke her when she read Anne's diary. She was so emotional about it. And I was very honoured to meet Audrey Hepburn in 1991 when I was just setting up the Anne Frank Trust, and she kindly agreed to be one of our very first patrons. Sadly, about 18 months after that, she died. Now, in the 1950s and 60s, a strange phenomenon started happening, that teenagers from all over the world read Anne's diary and started writing to Mr. Frank. Because although Anne was pretty scathing about the others in the hiding place, she spoke very kindly about her father. She admired and respected him. And she was very close with him. She saw him as a very liberal-minded, understanding man. Now, in the 1950s, of course, young people didn't feel that they could share their most intimate thoughts with their parents or teachers like they can now. They wouldn't be taken seriously. But teenagers started writing to Mr. Frank. Every single letter he received, he answered with the help of his wife, Fritzi, not using a word processor like he would now, but on an old typewriter. By 1960, a play had been produced about Anne Frank and a movie, but the area around the hiding place was starting to become very derelict, and there were plans by Amsterdam City Council to knock it down. Now, Mr. Frank went to see the mayor of Amsterdam and told him that people were coming on pilgrimages to look at where Anne Frank had been hidden, and although they couldn't get into the building, they were looking across the canal. And if they raised some money, could they turn it into a museum? And the mayor of Amsterdam agreed that they would restore the building. But Mr. Frank's idea wasn't for a backward-looking memorial, but more a forward-looking education centre. And on the 10th of May 1960, Anne's secret hiding place became public when it opened its doors for the first time. And there's Mr. Frank on the very day of the opening, up in that dusty old attic where Anne and Peter used to go to get some time together. You can only imagine what's going through his mind. Now, the first visitors to the Anne Frank house used to have to ring the doorbell, can you believe, and wait to be allowed in. But of course, over the years, the numbers grew and grew and grew. And this picture was taken, of course, before the pandemic. Nowadays, of course, the museum, I believe, is reopening soon. There's been a severe lockdown in Amsterdam over the last few weeks, but under social distancing regulations, which might be a better experience of actually experiencing the museum, because you won't have quite so many people. One little tip: if you do wish to visit the Anne Frank house, please book your tickets online about 6 weeks before your planned visit, otherwise you won't get in. Now, one day a member of the staff was sort of looking out of the window in 1984 and had an idea and went to see the director and suggested that perhaps there were so many people around the world that would love to see the hiding place. Could they create a mobile Anne Frank house and take it out to the world? And in 1985, the Anne Frank exhibition, called Anne Frank in the World, was created. It was first shown in Amsterdam, New York, and Frankfurt, the city of Anne's birth, and then started traveling around the world. For example, in 1990, the Anne Frank exhibition was one of the very first cultural projects to visit Moscow after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And people flocked to the exhibition, not only to learn about the Holocaust for the first time, because that had been under wraps for 45 years, but also they felt that they were very excited that a cultural project from the Western Europe was coming to them. Maybe that signified that one day they would be able to go and visit the West themselves, which of course came to pass. Now, since 1985, exhibitions have been traveling, but over the last 15 years, the way the exhibition has been presented has been changed rather dramatically, because teenagers are now taught to be peer educators. They become the docents of the exhibition. And these are sort of smaller exhibitions, not like the big ones that were traveling in the past. And they go into schools, directly into schools. And the teenagers become the educators. So it's teenagers educating teenagers about a teenager. And it's been a hugely successful project. So off we go with your suitcase quickly around the world. I'm aware that we're running out of time, but I'm going to take you a whistle-stop tour of the world. And this, for example, is in Kolkata in India in around 2016 in a school. You can see the peer educator on the left. And it was very interesting because the Indian kids themselves made the connections between the persecution against Anne and the iniquities of the caste system that still exists in Indian society. And here we are in Japan, very interesting, because for many years, the Holocaust was not talked about, even though Anne was a cultural icon in Japan. She was seen as a symbol of the suffering of children in war. But they linked it to the suffering of Japanese children after Nagasaki and Hiroshima, which was very worthy, but they never contextualized her story against that she was a victim of the Holocaust. And it's only recently, in recent years, since the Anne Frank exhibition has been traveling, that the Holocaust is taught in Japan. In Britain, we have been taking the story of Anne Frank into prisons since 2002. It's been a hugely successful project. And we've had prisoners being our peer educators, taking other prisoners around the exhibition. And something that we have been doing is taking Holocaust survivors into prisons to talk to the prisoners. And this is, you can see this lady is Eva Schloss, and she's actually the stepdaughter of Otto Frank. She was a playmate of Anne Frank's that her family lived in the Moveda Plain, and she knew Anne Frank before both families were forced into hiding and then deported to Auschwitz. And it was her mother, Fritzi, that actually married Otto after the war. And Eva is one of my co-founders of the Anne Frank Trust, and she's a very close friend. And here she is in a prison in London speaking to the prisoners. And believe me, when prisoners hear the story of the Holocaust, explained that by an elderly lady or gentleman explaining that they were in prison to be killed and to take every advantage that they're offered of learning a trade or taking a degree in prison. And it really, the prisoners take this really seriously, hearing it from a Holocaust survivor. It's been a remarkable project. And there's another prisoner you might recognize, Mr. Nelson Mandela. And he opened the Anne Frank exhibition in Johannesburg in 1994, when he'd just been president for a few months. And he described how he'd read Anne's diary before he was imprisoned and what it meant to him. And he made a point of smuggling the diary, having the diary smuggled into Robben Island prison, and encouraging the prisoners to read Anne's diary as a testament to the human spirit. And after the tour of that exhibition, the Anne Frank exhibition went on in a smaller version to visit schools in the townships, the very impoverished shanty towns around Johannesburg and Cape Town. And again, young people who had very little hope and aspiration for the future were trained to be exhibition docents, peer educators. And in this picture, one of the boys on the left-hand side, I'm not quite sure which one, actually wrote about his experiences of being an Anne Frank educator and entered into a competition run by the American Embassy in South Africa. And his description of being an Anne Frank educator won the competition. He was flown to DC and he was treated like a VIP. He came back to South Africa. He studied, he went to university, and is now a teacher, all thanks to being an Anne Frank peer educator. And there's a peer educator in Kazakhstan, of all places, in Central Asia, the land of the Mongols and Genghis Khan. And you think, what on earth would these young people think that they have in common with a little Jewish girl who lived in Western Europe in the middle of the last century? But you can see how avidly these young people are taking on board the information that their peer educator is giving them in a school in Kazakhstan. Here we are in Northern Ireland, and in the 1990s and early 2000s, both before and after the Good Friday Agreement, I did a lot of work in Catholic and Protestant communities in Northern Ireland, still very sectarian. Young people can live their lives growing up, going only to Catholic or Protestant schools, living only in Catholic or Protestant neighborhoods, not having the chance to mingle or integrate. We always ensured that when young people came to see the Anne Frank exhibition, Catholic and Protestant kids would come together. And that resulted in a cross-community newspaper being produced, but for the first time between a Catholic and Protestant school in the city of Armagh. And it was called, the newspaper was called Anne's Legacy, in honor of Anne Frank. And here we are again in a school in a shanty town, a very poor area of Sao Paulo in Brazil, a favela. And you can see these little peer educators, they're aged between 11 and 12, very, very young. They've been beautifully trained, and how excitedly they're showing the Anne Frank exhibition to the man in the red tie and explaining everything that happened in Europe after the First World War that brought about the rise of Nazism and the Holocaust and what happened to Anne Frank. And it didn't bother them at all that they were telling the history of Europe to none other than the Dutch foreign minister who was on a state visit to Brazil and visited the exhibition. I was actually there. I was one of the speakers, and it was quite a remarkable evening with these young people. And here we are in a school in London, a very, very multicultural school in London, where you can see them listening very intently to particularly a lot of Muslim children in this particular school, listening very intently to the story of the Jewish experience in the Holocaust. And here we are in Jaffna in Sri Lanka, where they endured a very bitter, very brutal 30-year civil war. And one of the very first projects to go to Jaffna in the north of Sri Lanka, which had been out of bounds for the 30 years of the Civil War, was the Anne Frank exhibition. And we brought together young people from both sides in that very long Civil War to learn about Anne Frank. And there you can see in her lovely purple sari, a peer-educated teenager. And the kids there are from both sides in the conflict. And they decided that together they were going to create a traveling exhibit similar to the Anne Frank exhibit to talk about their experiences in the Civil War. And my final photograph reflects the work that's being done in the United States with the peer education program. This particular school is in South Carolina. And through the peer education program, students learn to discuss topics such as tolerance and discrimination, but the educators themselves learn the skills that is necessary for visual literacy, public speaking, community organizing, and collaboration. Hugely successful program being run by the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect in the USA. I act as an advisor for the Anne Frank Center. So there we are, this little teenage girl who simply wanted to grow up, live her life, and make the world a better place. But because she was considered subhuman, Untermenschen, not worthy of the right to live, she died the most appalling death of disease and starvation in Bergen-Belsen camp. And as I say to young people, wow, wouldn't it be a boring world if we were all the same? On the 15th of July, 1944, Anne wrote these words in her diary. It's utterly impossible for me to build my life on a foundation of chaos, suffering, and death. I see the world being slowly transformed into a wilderness. I hear the approaching thunder that one day will destroy us too. I feel the suffering of millions. And yet, when I look up at the sky, I somehow feel that everything will change for the better, that this cruelty will end, and peace and tranquility will return once more. In the meantime, I must uphold my ideals. Perhaps the day will come when I'll be able to realize them. Yours, Anne M. Frank. Now, just 3 weeks after Anne wrote those words, she was arrested and started the 7-month journey to her terrible death. But thanks to tens of thousands of people around the world, educators, human rights activists, and most importantly, our young peer educators, Anne's ideals are being upheld. And if I can just give a little plug, this is my book, The Legacy of Anne Frank. I hope there's a copy in the Worcester Library. But you can buy it on Amazon. And the stories that I've been telling you from around the world and some of the remarkable people I've had the privilege to meet in my life. There's lots of chapters to just dip in and be truly inspired. It's been actually called a handbook of hope, this book. So I hope you will enjoy reading it and learning much more about the legacy and life of Anne Frank. So thank you so much for listening. And I really look forward to any questions you might have. I will stop the share now.
Oh, geez. Now I'm blue. Okay, anyway, thank you so much for such a sad and hopeful presentation. I didn't know about the peer educators and how important is that, and what they must get out of it is simply
Yes.
amazing.
Yes.
I have, where is the first? Liz stated that, so the documentary you were talking about, she used that when she taught middle school.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And she said it was wonderful to see her students actually meet and all of Anna's friends through that documentary. So.
Yeah, Meep was very much the star of that documentary. I just wondered if Liz, how she showed it, because it's a 2-hour documentary. Did she show it in different sort of sections, because it's a long film? I wonder if she showed it, for perhaps 40-minute chunks for class lessons.
I don't know. I'll wait to see if she responds. She has been to the Anne Frank house. She was there in 1979 and again in 1995. She does plan on visiting this year, and she was just asking if anyone knew what the best time to visit the museum would be.
I would suggest try and get tickets for, and remember to get them online, early in the morning, first thing in the morning. I think it opens about 9 o'clock in the morning, or last thing in the evening. And they have different sort of opening hours, summer and winter seasons. So check what the opening hours are and try and just try and get first thing in the morning, last thing at night. You're liable to get less people. And I see that Liz has responded. Yes, they were in 40-minute chunks, and showed the whole thing as well. Excellent.
That I went to the Anne Frank house in like 1998, and there was no wait getting tickets online, and so that's just it's inspiring. That, I mean, there were plenty of people there, don't get me wrong, but it sounds like there's just a lot more people going now than there were in 19.
Well, ironically less now because of
well, yes,
traveling and social distancing, and I think for a while they'll continue the social distancing, which, as I say, if you can get the tickets, if you can get the tickets, it's probably a better time to see it when there is more social distancing, because you're not going through with all the crowds.
Sure. So another comment: what a wonderful approach the U.S. Holocaust Museum has in teaching about the Holocaust to this generation. The concept of 4 different roles that people portrayed during the Holocaust: victim, perpetrator, bystander, rescuer, seems to resonate very clearly with the story of Anne Frank and her family.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, because we've got all. Yes, absolutely.
Thanks for the beautiful, sad program. That's from Betty. And then, well, this is from Liz, which you saw some of what she wrote, but she thanks, thank you for the opportunity to relive my study of the life of Anne Frank and her family, hiding and afterward. I love your book, exclamation point. We used many of your materials when we read the play and the Prentice Hall text in grade 8 in the Worcester County Public Schools.
Fantastic. So look, the Anne Frank Centre aren't obviously physically touring their peer education exhibits at the moment, but please, and I think Liz would be an ideal candidate for this, as soon as, things start normalizing again, I'm sure they would be delighted to bring a peer education program where a representative from the Anne Frank Centre would come and train your students to be peer educators. Sounds like it's the perfect school to be doing it, and perhaps other schools within Worcester County as well.
That would be wonderful. I think the kids would get a lot out of that.
It's annefrank.com. Annefrank.com. Just contact them.
I'm just going to write that down. Well, I can remember that.
That's pretty easy. Yeah.
I say that now.
Liz retired. She's still got colleagues there.
A question from Paul Meep, and he put her last name, but I don't want to mispronounce it. Was not punished for hiding the Frank family. Is there more to that part of the story?
Yeah, I'm asked a lot about this actually. What happened to the helpers? Okay, so interestingly, the arresting officer was from Vienna, and Miep was also from Vienna, and they recognized each other's accents. She'd been sent after the First World War to the Netherlands as a sort of malnourished teenager, and she stayed for the rest of her life. And he, of course, berated her. What was a good Austrian girl doing hiding Jews? And of course, the punishment would have been very steep. And so he gave her a good telling off and let her go. She was very brave, actually. She immediately went around and tried to get some money to buy the freedom of the Frank family, because, and the others, of course, in hiding, because at that stage in the war, you could buy their freedom because it was getting towards the end of the war. Unfortunately, she was sent into a Gestapo office, to do that, and the officer happened to be listening to the BBC on the radio, which would be a punishable act, and so he literally threw her out because he would have been punished if she'd reported that. So unfortunately, I mean, she was incredibly brave. So she was not arrested. Bep, the secretary, the young secretary, she was only a teenager, when she saw them being arrested, she fled, and so she hid. So she wasn't arrested. But Victor Kugler and Johannes Kleiman were both arrested. They were taken down, interrogated, and arrested and imprisoned. Now, Johannes Kleiman was very sick because the stress of hiding the families for 2 long years really took a toll on his health, and he had extreme gastric problems. And he was actually in a hospital, a camp hospital, and he was visited by the Red Cross, who demanded his release. Victor Kugler actually managed to escape because he was being transported from one prison to another when there happened to be an Allied bombing raid on the transport. And he took advantage of that and ran and hid on a farm. And then, believe it or not, he cycled. He was given a bicycle, or took a bicycle, and he cycled back to his own home where he hid out the final few weeks of the war. So Kleiman and Kugler were arrested. Miep and Bep weren't arrested. So I just wonder if there are any more questions.
Yes, there one more came in. Oh, look, I'm not blue anymore. What prompted Ms. Perry's lifelong study of Anne Frank?
Well, it wasn't quite lifelong. I've been involved since 1988, when I was in between sort of work and projects, and I received a call. It's one of those serendipitous things from my very good friend and rabbi in my hometown on the south coast of England, where I lived at the time, saying, I've heard about this exhibit that's come to England from the Anne Frank house, and you know that my father and Otto Frank were very close friends. My friend was Dutch. Would you help me bring it to our town? And we formed a committee, and it was wonderful. And 9 months later, the Anne Frank exhibit, which is a dinosaur of an exhibition now compared to today's exhibitions with color and technology and everything. This was big and black and white and quite old-fashioned looking at the time. Not at the time, but now. It came to our town, and within 3 weeks we had 10,000 visitors, and I thought, oh my goodness, I really love this. I would love to do something with this. So I literally got myself on a plane to Amsterdam that fall, went to meet the director of the Anne Frank house and convinced him they needed a British representative to keep the exhibition on the road. And for my sins, I was appointed the British representative of the Anne Frank house. And in 1991, a group of people, including my friend, whose father was close with Otto Frank, and another friend who was close with Otto Frank, and Eva Schloss, who was Otto Frank's stepdaughter and Anne Frank's playmate, the 4 of us formed the Anne Frank Trust as British charity. And we launched it in the Houses of Parliament in 1991. I ran it from my own home initially with 1 member of staff. And when I retired 5 years ago, there were 35 members of staff. So it's been quite a journey, as you can imagine.
A very rewarding one, I would think.
Oh, absolutely, totally. It's been a great privilege, and I've met some incredible people along the way. And now I tell the story, whether it's traveling around in person, and I spend a lot of time in the States under normal circumstances, or whether it's been over the power of Zoom over the last year.
Okay, one more question, and that will wrap things up. So the monument in Bergen-Belsen, are there any remains there moved from mass grave? Any DNA work?
No, not. I don't think there ever could be, because there's thousands, tens of thousands of people buried in those mass graves. About 10 years ago, as opening an exhibition, I met a lovely man who came up to me and said, I think I might have been the person to bury Anne and Margot Frank. And I said, well, why was that? And he was a reverend. And he said that by the spring of 1945, there were so few of us left alive, because he was obviously a prisoner himself, to do the burying, that the chances are, because so few of us were fit enough to bury the bodies, and there were so many thousands of them, that the chances are I might have been the person who buried Anne and Margot into that mass grave.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. And thank you so much for being here, Jillian. Very well done. Jillian will be back in early April to talk about
something completely different.
Something completely different.
Yes.
It'll be about my words aren't coming to me. It's about afternoon English tea.
Yes, it's the social history of English high tea, which is another of my pet passions. And you might say, well, what's that got to do with Anne Frank? Well, it's basically because when I retired and started lecturing, I was auditioned to lecture on cruise ships, which has been great fun, actually pre-pandemic, and I hope will be again someday. But they like you to have a bigger portfolio of lectures that you can offer every day at sea. And one of my pet passions has always been afternoon tea. And so I really looked into it, and it's been very exciting. And I promise you, you'll learn lots of things you never knew. That I cover some American topics as well. And I've just been commissioned to write a book about it. So that's lovely.
Well done. All right. So I hope you all join us. Bring your tea. You want tea. I'm going to stop recording right now.